So we'll go ahead and start just by taking a moment to settle the mind a little bit, try to move into a different space mentally. So just sit comfortably and just gently close the eyes and just focus on your breathing for a moment. Noticing as thoughts and feelings and other perceptions arise in the mind and just letting them go. Coming back again and again to the present moment physical sensation of the air as it passes into and back out of the tip of the nostrils. Just trying to hold your mind on that sensation. Not energizing or following anything else that arises, but also not experiencing judgment or frustration. Just lifting your awareness from the distraction and gently placing it back on the breath. And then when the mind feels a bit more calm, just on your own, try to set an altruistic motivation for being here, thinking that we've seen the title of the course and how to be happy. But also we can think about that we are just one sentient being. And we also want happiness for others. So we try to set a motivation of finding tools, finding techniques that will bring about not only our own welfare, our own benefit, but will help us to have the space, to have the ability to be able to benefit others. All right. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this course on how to be happy, Lama Zopa Rinpoche's book on how to be happy. On the website, there is a link. We did say on the website that there's no required reading, so I'm not expecting or anticipating that anyone will do the reading. You're most welcome to if you would like. My thought is we have 6 weeks. It's a 6-week class. And the format really largely is open to what is helpful for everyone who's here. We're calling this a level 1 class, a class that we're referring to as accessible entry-level class. And the goal of a lot of the level 1 classes is to be interactive, is to be focused on questions and answers and that sort of thing. So the format is really what is helpful for everyone. I will be prepared to speak about my goal. My thinking is, because we have 6 weeks, to think about maybe about 20 pages or so of the text as we go through. My hope is to be able to touch on pretty much all of the insights, the wisdom that Lama Zopa in his text is giving us. To me, in my mind, when we say level 1, when we say accessible entry level material, my thinking, my view, my approach is, in a way, trying to recognize that we can try to forget about the fact that it was written by a Buddhist monk, and try to forget about the fact that it's part of what, that we could label it as part of this tradition that has this worldview and so on, and to just think about it in terms of this. These are insights, these are observations about the mind and about how the mind works. And to really just try to think about it on that level, that these are observations that do have a history, that do have, a cultural history and so on. But these are really just profound cognitive, psychological insights about the mind and about how we relate to other sentient beings, and what reliably does lead to a greater sense of contentment, and what does reliably lead to a sense of disconnectedness, a sense of being at odds, being in competition, being disconnected, being kind of narrow and isolated and more painful, rather than being expansive and being open and being connected and being content. So that's how I think about it. I don't think about it in terms. So it's true that, broadly speaking, we do only have an hour in these classes. We have 6 1-hour classes. And there are, at Tupten Norbu Ling, maybe we'll get a chance to kind of chat about people, whether people have been here before or people's backgrounds, that sort of thing. At Tupten Norbu Ling, there are a wide variety of different levels of courses taught by a wide variety of different people. And so you may find other things that you resonate more with. And that's great. This is about kind of just presenting information on a variety of different levels, and then people kind of see what fits for them, what works for them. So as this introductory accessible level 1 class, it is true that we won't be talking about sort of the path to enlightenment in the same way that the deeper, more advanced classes might present. But we are going to try to keep coming back to a very, very practical, very daily life experience way of finding tools and techniques for cultivating greater contentment. But also at the same time recognizing, as I tried to sort of explain, what we'll find, I think there'll be a few things that repeat, a few themes that repeat. And one of them is that what we'll find is that one of the keys, one of the insights that is contained in this wisdom is that this works most effectively when we try also to have that altruistic view. We might come to this course recognizing or being in tune or in touch with our own suffering, our own frustrations, our own obstacles, and just wanting to get rid of those, just wanting to find a method for not having those. But what we'll find is the more that we can move into a space where we have a wider concern, where our motivation, our kind of base level motivation becomes more and more altruistic. That is what will unlock this ability to have more ease, more contentment, rather than starting from and staying in a place where we're just kind of looking out for the one, for the I, for the self. And that is the extent of our circle of concern. We'll kind of see how we have to start thinking about this idea of happiness in a little bit different way than maybe we have. And that's another insight. That's another kind of key, that the ordinary way of thinking about happiness that we've probably grown up with and that we've probably internalized to some degree has that flavor of individualism, has that flavor of just looking out for collecting what I would like, what I find enjoyable. And then we define failing at that. We define meeting with obstacles as something that is inevitably a suffering, painful experience. So we'll be looking at how we have to start using new definitions of these things in order to really be successful. So let's see, I've seen, I think maybe most of the names here. I'm just not sure. Caitlin, have you been to the center before, or? I didn't think so. Your first time just today? Great. And so Margaret, I think I've seen before. This morning, I think maybe are you relatively new or been around for a while? You can unmute yourself if you would like. You don't have to.
Sorry about that. I'm a student at Tipton Kungaling in Deerfield Beach, Florida. But, since Zoom has become so popular, you can shop for different classes. And I was at a meditation of yours once before. So thank you so much for, doing this class. It's good to be here.
Right. It's wonderful. So, yeah. So we'll kind of move into the material a bit. So we are on class 1 of How to Be Happy by Lama Zopa. And chapter 1, if you do have the book or you do decide to read the book, chapter 1 is called Happiness. And this is Lama Zopa here, a little bit more recent photo of Lama Zopa on the right side, and then a longer ago taken photo of both Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa on the left side. And I think that I think it's clear, that they embody this wisdom, that they have internalized this wisdom. And so they know, that the only difference, Buddhism would say that the only difference between ourselves and these great masters like Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is that they've already internalized this wisdom. There's no difference in terms of they're not a different kind of, they don't have any mystical differences that are baked into their minds. They're just already familiar. They've already done the work. They've already internalized this wisdom that we are starting to, that we are trying to internalize. So Lama Zopa starts by making the observation that, which is, we all know this, that all sentient beings, not even all humans, but all sentient beings, every one of us wants happiness. And we don't, and not only do we want it in just kind of a daily life kind of way, we want an unchanging, ultimate happiness that we can experience forever. That's, if you were to ask people if that's what they wanted, then everybody, all sentient beings would agree with that. The trouble is, to a degree, we have to think about, do we think that's possible? That's kind of the first stumbling block, is thinking about, to what extent are we really convinced that we can accomplish a sense of contentment, a sense of happiness? What have we so far, what have we become familiar with? What kind of definition of happiness are we using? And are we settling? Buddhism would suggest that perhaps we're using, Buddhism might suggest that we're using a wrong definition of happiness, and that we're using insufficient methods, that we're using the wrong kinds of techniques or tools. And so what I would say is that maybe, especially in our society, in our culture, we grow up with a view that, as I said before, maybe to a degree, this idea that happiness is the extent to which we can assemble the external circumstances that we find pleasant, and the extent to which we can consistently separate ourselves from the external situations or circumstances that we are averse to. And that's kind of the definition of the American dream. In a way, that's what we're told. That's the cultural view, I would say, that we've been given. And Buddhism would say that that is both an incorrect definition, and it also leads to an incorrect set of tools, a set of tools or techniques or processes that are going to ultimately be frustrating, that are going to ultimately lead to more disconnection, more anxiety, more depression, more strife, rather than greater ease, greater contentment. And what this comes down to, I think another one of these things that we'll be able to keep coming back to, is the reality that the only thing that persists in every moment of our lives is our mind. And, of course, we could say our body too, because at the time of our death, body and mind will separate. So this form is also going to accompany us. But the form, we can't really change. The form, we can make it thinner or larger. We can kind of change its musculature. But the kind of, the way that it experiences taste and touch, and those are all pretty fixed. it's the mind that accompanies every moment of this life and is the thing that is incredibly malleable, incredibly able to be cultivated or developed consciously, intentionally over time. Whereas external events and circumstances are to some degree within a certain amount of our control, but very largely outside of our control. And we've all experienced that in a very deep way over the last year. We all went into this last year thinking of it going to be just like the year before and the year before, and it was very different. But of course, we've also, every single day, we are also presented with the wisdom, presented with the reality that external circumstances are not within our full control. And so this is one of those disconnects that this wisdom is helping us to see, that if our definition is the extent to which I succeed in bringing in what I find pleasurable and being separate from what I find difficult, then I'm giving up my contentment. I'm giving up my happiness to what happens around me, to what I'm able to experience. And then I'm assenting to suffering. And Buddhism would also say I'm assenting to a very small fraction of what's possible. I'm assenting to defining the range of possibility to something that's only sensorial, to something that's very coarse, very gross. Gross meaning in the opposite of subtle. And that's a shame. Buddhism would say that that's a real shame if we go through life with that, assenting to those things, giving up that power, giving up that control, and two, only thinking that kind of sensorial perspective is all that there is, that there's nothing deeper, there's nothing more lasting, there's nothing, this idea of unchanging ultimate happiness that can be experienced forever. We have to give that up if we assent to this idea that all that there is what I can possess and what I can be separate from. So what Lama Zopa goes on to then say is, two things. One is that the mind has so much more power. The mind has so much more potential to be able to give rise to these stable, deep-seated sources of contentment. And we also need to start thinking about moving away from that previous definition and that previous methodology. And here, there's a new tool that he's giving us, this idea of the relationship between, here, just the first one is loving kindness and happiness. So what this is starting to introduce, what this is starting to get at, is the mental states that permeate the mind and how they are what truly give rise to that sense of contentment and a stable, lasting contentment. Rather than defining it as, well, I've succeeded in getting this collection of externalities, or I've succeeded in being separated from this other collection of externalities, rather than thinking about it in those terms, here, the first way that we can think about it is, how familiar am I with loving kindness? How familiar is my mind with wishing for oneself and all other sentient beings to be free of suffering and to have happiness and the causes, and to be free of the causes of suffering and to possess the causes of happiness? So that goes back to what I was alluding to a bit earlier, this idea of this altruistic baseline, and the importance of that altruistic baseline. And this is also getting at an understanding that it might be new in a way to our way of thinking, which is to say that we don't normally think of loving kindness as something that a person can train in, as something that a person can intentionally cultivate over a long period of time. We normally look at a person and say, oh, they are a kind person. They have a kind disposition. They are a caring, we say that they're a caring soul. And we kind of think of it as a stable facet of some types of personality types, or a trait that maybe that some people are born with and that you kind of either have or you don't have. And Buddhism completely disagrees with that way of thinking. Buddhism says that whatever degree of loving kindness we have today, in this moment, we can grow. Whatever seed or potential we do possess, we can cause that small spark, that potential, whatever it is, we can cause that to become greater and greater over time and more stable over time. We can expand that to deeply and spontaneously arise in connection with a broader and broader scope of other sentient beings as we go through life. And what Lama Zopa is saying here is that protects the mind, that kind of training is what unlocks that it isn't true that going through life only thinking about one's own needs and only thinking about one's own interests and one's own desires, it isn't true that is able to give rise to this stable sense of contentment. But that's the message that we are so often bombarded with. That's the kind of individualistic view that's so deeply embedded in our society. And so we don't have to, but, Buddhism, Lama Zopa is inviting us to think about that, and to think about the extent to which we can make progress in doing something else is the extent to which we will be more and more successful over time in getting what we want. Any thoughts or questions so far? So the implication, this next piece, is another tool that we've kind of touched on, I would say, is responsibility. And this is kind of what This goes along with thinking about these things in terms of being bodies of knowledge, in terms of being insights that a person can develop or train in. One implication of that is this idea of responsibility, meaning that if I haven't trained in these things, then I can start. And it's only up to me to decide that I should start. And as I was saying before, in the beginning, the only difference between oneself and a great being is that they did make that decision to start, and then they never stopped. And then they got that the methods that they employed reliably bring those results. And they just kept going until those results actually dawned in their own experience. And so what Lama Zopa is saying is that we tend, if we go along, if we continue to assent to that first view, that sort of more cultural view, that happiness is kind of more of an excitement. That's another aspect of the cultural view, the cultural definition, I would say, is that we think of happiness as an excitation. We kind of think of it as Christmas morning, that kind of, and that's the sort of cultural view, again, that we're sort of given. And so we go through life trying to make every day Christmas Day, or whatever day. Maybe you came from a different, I came from a Christian background, so, but you can use whatever works for you. We try to wake up and we try to think, how can I turn today into that feeling of excitation, into that feeling, and that also relates very much to this idea of the externalities, the bringing things in and the pushing things away. And the point that Lama Zopa makes here is that this will give rise to blaming other sentient beings when that doesn't go well, when things aren't working out. We think because we started from a place where we assented to a methodology and a definition that was mistaken, the implication becomes that it's their fault for not being the kind of externality that I needed in order to be happy. And so what Lama Zopa Rinpoche is encouraging, or again, inviting us to think about, is that this gives rise to blaming and not taking responsibility for the content of our own mind. And it is the content of our own mind that really is what gives rise to that sense of contentment. For example, if we just link this back to what he said previously about loving kindness, about wanting sentient beings to be happy and wanting sentient beings to be free of suffering. If some other person is acting in a way that we find challenging, then what Lama Zopa is saying here is that because that it really isn't their behavior that is the problem. What is the problem is that we don't deeply and naturally and spontaneously wish for them to have happiness and for them to be free of suffering. We are looking at them and expecting them to be the kind of externality that we enjoy, that pleases us. And they're not doing that right now because they're acting in a challenging and difficult way. They are violating our unreasonable expectation. And when they violate our unreasonable expectation, we suffer. And so if we are free of that unrealistic expectation, we'd also be free of suffering. Their behavior could be the same, but we would be able to experience it without suffering. We would be able to experience it from a place of greater spaciousness, and it would not disturb our contentment. Because, and we can try to, in our own experience, maybe one thing over the next week, to kind of try to experiment with. Again, thinking about this in a practical way that has tools and techniques that we actually start to integrate, is this idea that Buddhism suggests or states, asserts maybe, that the mind can't really have two qualities in the same moment, meaning that if the mind is absorbed in loving kindness, the mind in that moment can't give rise to anger. It can give rise to anger in the next moment, but it can't give rise to anger in the moment that the mind is absorbed in loving kindness. So one thing to try is to, in meditation, maybe you have a practice or maybe you don't, but you could just try to sit quietly, and we can, people can ask, we can talk about these sorts of things as we go through, but just try to sit quietly and think about a person who, not, the person that you find most distressing, but just someone maybe that day or that week that irritated you a little bit. And so start first by thinking about what was it that gave rise, what is it that they did that irritated you? And so think about that for a minute, and then you'll notice how the mind, is irritated, and you have that feeling of, that kind of tight, isolated, painful feeling in the body and mind. But then try to give rise to some feeling of wanting them to be free of suffering and wanting them to have happiness. You could start by, what's often done is to use another sentient being that you naturally feel that way toward, in order to have to give rise to that sense in your own body and mind. You first think about a person that very easily that kind of thought or feeling arises toward, and then you bring to mind this person that irritates you. And you just experienced what it was like to wish for this other sentient being that you're quite close to. You just experienced, what are the kinds of phrases that I use? What does it feel like in my body and mind to wish that for someone? And now all I have to do is remember that, and then intentionally try to feel that way toward this other person that it doesn't spontaneously or naturally arise toward. And Buddhism would say, if we do that a lot, we start to get better and better at that naturally arising. Yeah. So this is about, what he's saying here is that ultimately, I would say, a major theme of Buddhist thinking is this idea of starting to take responsibility for the content of what we are bringing to our interactions, and not blaming the other person, but thinking, if I were familiar in a deeper way with a more constructive way of being in the world, then this wouldn't bother me. It only bothers me because I've not yet developed that familiarity. And so, because I have no access to this other person's mind, I only have access to my own mind, it's incumbent upon me, if I want to have this go better in other situations, other similar situations in the future, it's incumbent upon me to use the access that I do have to my own mind to be able to bring a different set of conditions to the next experience, because sentient beings are going to are going to present me with these opportunities for the rest of my life. So am I going to give rise to this aversion for the rest of my life? Or am I going to take responsibility and start to train the mind in a way that will allow me to be able to experience that without it disturbing my contentment? So that's chapter 1, where he's called happiness, and chapter 2 is called meditation, which, and again, people may or may not have a practice, but it is tied up. It is very much part of the Buddhist view. And of course, in terms of this class and in terms of this wisdom and these insights, there's nothing here that's in any way incompatible with any other spiritual tradition or view. A person can meditate on loving kindness or compassion or patience or generosity. All of these things that we're talking about, none of them are in any way incompatible with a different religious or spiritual tradition. So meditation as a technique, as a technology, is completely compatible with all. There might be aspects of the Buddhist worldview in a more technical sense that are different, but this class is really going to focus on these more basic universal principles where there is no contradiction or disagreement of any kind. So what Lama Zopa is going to talk about in the next chapter, again, he's going to encourage us to think about using meditation to start to have a practice in daily life, and to use that as one of the principal vehicles of our own growth and development. So here we do mean setting aside time, ideally at some point every day, to focus on cultivating positive states of mind, to intentionally place the mind. Tibetan Buddhism in particular, defines meditation as becoming more and more familiar with a virtuous object. So Thupten Norbu Ling has a half an hour meditation class every morning at 7 o'clock Mountain Time. So that's, if you're awake, that's an option. And it's quite good to meditate in the mornings. So even if you're not normally awake, perhaps, so that depends on your time zone and all of those things. But eventually trying to work up to, and again, we can talk about strategies and we can deal with that as a group as we go through the material, but Buddhism would suggest that it is a really important inner technology that we can cultivate. So what he's saying here, again, this idea of right and wrong conception is getting at kind of all of these things that we've talked about, how we have to, or again, if we really do want to try to move beyond, if we really do want to try to move beyond this more limited understanding of happiness and suffering, then we do have to think about what mental conceptions, how am I approaching my understanding of contentment? How am I approaching my understanding of what I am trying to achieve? Because of the inherent limitation that is really baked into the conception of happiness and suffering is defined by my wealth or my status or my reputation or my possessions, or my ability to enter into particular relationships. Again, that seeds, that gives up the inherent control that really is there in the mind. And all we have to do is start to develop a greater and greater confidence that that really is the nature of the mind, that there truly is something beyond that. And then we have to give that time and attention, in the same way that we've spent a lot of time and attention pursuing externalities. We have to start thinking about, am I giving time and attention to my spiritual practice, to my the cultivation of my qualities, the cultivation of my inner qualities? So again, another one of, so just so you guys know, maybe you don't have the book yet again, but this is on page 2 of the book, this idea. I've put things in a little bit different order, but Lama Zopa puts this on page 2: cultivate the thought that everyone you meet in all circumstances is fulfilling all of your wishes. This is the gate to true happiness. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche is the International Spiritual Director of FPMT, the international organization that Thupten Norba Ling is an affiliate of. And I find that, his teachings are very direct and very, in a way, kind of very intense. This idea that he's putting on page 2 of this book is not an easy, this is part of what they would call the mind training, or, Lojong teachings in Buddhism. But this is another one of these, I would say, tools that we can start to try to work with in daily life, that everyone that we meet is giving us an opportunity to develop our qualities. And so this doesn't apply, again, this is going back to reframing the view that I think to some degree we've internalized, which is the things I find pleasurable, I'm super excited about, The things I find aversive, I'm super bummed about. And the goal of my life is just to bring in as much as I can, these really pleasurable things. And the goal of my life is to just be separated from these things that I'm challenged by. Here, he isn't saying cultivate the thought that those that you like are fulfilling your wishes. He's saying cultivate the view everyone you meet is fulfilling your wishes. So one thing that we can start to think about, again, over maybe the next week, is what are my wishes? What is it that I do wish for my life? What is the kind of center? What is the core of the purpose of the rest of my life? Buddhism, the Buddhist view would say that we can't really talk about a purpose that pre-exists us, but we can talk about giving ourselves a purpose. We can decide, we can choose our own purpose. And so there's different ways of thinking about that. And there's sort of the historical, traditional Buddhist view of the idea of enlightenment, which maybe Lama Zopa does in the later chapters of this book, kind of in a way touch on that. So, in some way we'll touch on it at some point, but still here, I would say that the main takeaway, the main tool here, if we are going to try to really connect with a stable sense of contentment, then when we think about what is it that I wish for my life, the field of answer there, because again, I'm not going to, there isn't a right answer and there isn't a wrong answer, but Buddhism would say perhaps that there's a constellation or a field of potential answers that are more likely to to give rise to this contentment. And then there's a field or a universe of possibilities that are less likely. And so if we start to have, just again, in a general way, this altruistic view where we think ultimately I'm kind of in this for the rest of my life to develop my own internal capacities, my own internal potentials. And Buddhism does have a way of thinking about that, but regardless, the mind, as I said, the mind is something that is a non-physical energy that's incredibly malleable, that's incredibly powerful. And if we take as our purpose its cultivation, it's the unfolding of its potential, then from that perspective, there are ways, regardless of what is happening around us, there are ways of thinking, there are ways of transforming that into finding the lesson, in finding what is it in what is happening that I can use to bring me in line or in tune with that goal. So if we go to work every day, with the motivation or the view that this really isn't what I'd like to be doing, and I don't really find it particularly fulfilling because I'm answering the phones or I'm typing things or whatever it might be, and that's not particularly amazing. And, I'm kind of thinking of it in terms of, well, they're paying me and that money allows me to go on vacation sometimes. It allows me to kind of own things I enjoy owning. It allows me to be able to have a greater degree of success in bringing things that I like into my perspective. I would say that these things that we've been looking at today, we can kind of, because we spend a lot of time at work, and so it's kind of an important field to be thinking about what we do for 8-10 hours a day and how the mind is during that time. I would say that we're kind of setting ourselves up for problems with that perspective. And what Buddhism would suggest, what Lama Zopa I think is suggesting here, is instead, if we just think of all of the moments of the day, regardless of whether they are in the car going to work, whether they are at work, whether they are at home, regardless, they're just the moments that I am alive today. If we think that all of those moments are part of this aspiration, this wish to grow my qualities, to grow and actualize my potential, then every time I answer the phone, every time I engage in some task, I am being of some degree of service to some other person. There's someone that needs this. There's someone, whether I'm selling insurance or whether I'm typing reports, there's another sentient being that is affected by this product, by whatever it is I'm producing or doing in this moment. And so my act, my behavior is an act of service to that other person. And my goal is simply to be of benefit to that other person. It isn't to think about that this is a series of kind of unenjoyable tasks that I'm receiving a paycheck in exchange for. This is a series of moments where I'm able to give something that other people find useful and need me to do well, because there's some benefit, there's some reason why we're all kind of agreeing to be in whatever it is that we're doing together. The world needs salespeople, and all that. That's how, that's what people do in that moment, and they need us to do that well. So we offer that as a service. And so in that way, they are allowing us to reframe that in a way that gives rise to our contentment. So then this is what we'll end on today. Again, this is reiterating, for one, I think, again, responsibility, that we can't rely on any other. We might have a teacher, we might be inspired by something, but that wisdom, that insight that we're inspired by, it will remain separate from us until we do the work to incorporate it into our mind. And then when we start to, this is what we'll pick up on. And again, another one of these tools, another one of these techniques, this idea, which is reinforcing this altruistic view, that beyond sort of just tolerating other sentient beings, we need to develop an actual view of cherishing other sentient beings. And that, again, that is another one of these tools that unlocks genuine, lasting, unchanging contentment within oneself, that irrespective of the other person's behavior, irrespective of my expectations, I cherish this other sentient being. And if I can remain absorbed in that wisdom, in that insight, I will be free of suffering and I will be deeply content. And really, my ability to be successful in that is what will play a large role in how the rest of my life goes in these difficult circumstances. Because these difficult circumstances will present themselves to me again and again and again. And then when I can be free of that, then, the extent to which I can be free of that will depend upon my ability to hold my mind in that absorption, in that wisdom of cherishing. But we are out of time for today. So let's just, we usually just kind of dedicate at the end of our classes. So we just sort of think, we set a virtuous motivation at the beginning. So we just kind of think, may whatever positive energy I've created, may that ripen in the best way to support myself in my own continued spiritual growth and development. And may it ripen in whatever way sentient beings need for their continued spiritual growth and development. May I progress along the path. May I develop my qualities more and more so that I can tap into this genuine, unchanging reservoir of contentment that is naturally abiding in my own mind. All right. Thanks for coming. I hope to see everybody next time. And again, so of course, come with questions and, we can deal with questions and that kind of thing, make it interactive.
Thank
Any,
you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Venerable Dondrub.